The Valley of the Kings was a sort of city of the dead, a place where numerous monarchs, pharaohs of ancient Egypt, were buried. In this site, which is located about 5 kilometers from the Nile River near the city of Luxor, and near what at its time was the capital of the Egyptian Empire, Thebes, the pharaohs of that time, were buried in great mausoleums in a place near a mountain known as the Mountain of the Goddess of Silence, a completely desert site. If you can see the photographs right now, you will see that they are places where there is practically no vegetation and where there is a reddish, dry, arid sand. Moreover, it is a place that indeed is incredibly silent. There, from ancient times, from the 18th dynasty, in the time of Thutmose I, they began to bury the pharaohs in sumptuous tombs, impressive tombs, where there was everything you can imagine preparing the journey of that monarch who was also considered a variant of a deity. The pharaohs were not only rulers, but were something much beyond that. Therefore, it was important that they had an adequate place to await the return, and that upon the return they would have everything they might need in that very place, from their weapons, their jewels, their servants, and their body appropriately embalmed. Those are the mummies, the bodies of those pharaohs richly embalmed, carefully embalmed with their servants, with the other nobles, and in fact, even with their own cats. All of that so that upon their return they would have where to be, and so that the journey to the other side would be pleasant and everything would be prepared. The cosmogony of that time required this, and thus it is how the Valley of the Kings began to be occupied with Thutmose I. But there are many other tombs there. Rameses and many others found this place appropriate to build their own mausoleums. The pharaoh used to order the construction of his tomb in life in such a way that there would be enough time to make it as sumptuous as possible. Because, there was a secret. When a pharaoh died, there were only 70 days between the death and the moment in which he would be laid to rest and the appropriate funerary rites would be performed in the tomb. It was not whenever they felt like it. Therefore, there was a period in which the mummification could be carried out. After that, the time had already passed, which is why each pharaoh took care to build his tomb and prepare for the journey to the other life. In this site and for 500 years, the pharaohs were buried. However, this stopped at a certain moment. At the end of the 20th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs, the area known as the Valley of the Kings was abandoned. A series of social movements made the capital move from Thebes to another place, and this fell under the control of the priests of Amun, who obviously no longer continued burying pharaohs there. But moreover, it was the period of decline of ancient Egypt, and obviously there were moments of much scarcity, of much poverty. Thus, the tombs of the great pharaohs were looted back in antiquity. We are speaking of some moment near 1000 before Christ. When all these great tombs were looted, thieves and even the priests themselves would go there to look for some little thing they might be lacking. Many of these acts of vandalism included stripping the mummies of everything that could be stripped from them, abandoning the mummified bodies thrown here and there. There came a moment when the priests themselves decided that it was necessary to vacate the tombs, and thus they began to transfer the remaining sarcophagi, the remains that were left the mummies, and the few possessions that remained were taken to a place known as Deir el-Bahari, a secret refuge where the remains were shut in and protected. The great funerary constructions were abandoned, and very soon those places passed from one hand to another. And thus there was a time in which they might have served as stables. There is evidence of that. There was also a time in which they served as a place of pilgrimage, but not for the pilgrims to do something there, rather to wait there for the passing of sandstorms and similar things. Afterwards the Greeks and the Romans arrived and were astonished by what was there, and they were so astonished that many left graffiti. There are marks on the walls where the passage of those tourists from very ancient times is indicated, those who came to know these regions. In fact, the coexistence between Romans and Egyptians gave way so that later the code of the ancient hieroglyphs could be deciphered. That point was advancing until, when finally that region converts to Islam, these old constructions are left totally abandoned. They no longer have any meaning. The great tombs of the ancient pharaohs remain there, and it would not be until 1799 when, under the orders of Napoleon, the first French arrive, and are astonished. It is the birth of contemporary Egyptology. They are astonished by what they are seeing, by those gigantic mausoleums that are not pyramids. It must be clarified, the Valley of the Kings is not the same thing as the area of the pyramids of Giza. They have similar functions, but it is not the same. And when the French arrive here at that end of the 18th century, they are astonished. But not only astonished, rather delighted, because they also find a sort of engraved rock that signifies the possibility of translating everything that is on the walls of these temples and of these funerary enclosures. It is the Rosetta Stone. To the amazement of all, the Rosetta Stone had a sort of pharaonic decree in which it indicated in ancient Egyptian, in hieroglyphs in ancient Greek, and in a language known as Demotic, in a Demotic script, an edict, an order. And coincidentally, in the three forms of writing it was the same message which serves to decipher, and that is when the growth of Egyptology begins, because the people who deciphered that can now know what the walls say, make a timeline of who lived here, who made these prodigies, these marvels, who made these diagrams what they wanted to say. Why is this drawing here? Who is this other one? A timeline of the pharaohs is made, a genealogy, but of course everything is very damaged. Even so, the archaeologists manage to recover many things, and at the end of the day they find the burial grounds of mummies there, where the remains of the great mummies of those ancient pharaohs are, which include of course some pectorals, they include some inscriptions. The priests of Amun themselves, when they make the transfer, are careful to leave for posterity information about this, and the knowledge is enormous. Although the Valley of the Kings as such is no longer so rich because they were all tombs that had been looted. What they find there makes them see that there were dynasties, that after one pharaoh another followed, and that this one in turn had a successor, and that each one of them gave data about their predecessors and their successors in a marvel of history. But someone is missing. Several of the researchers over the years, and from deciphering that, lost in the desert, in very difficult conditions by the way, begin to discover that someone is missing. There is a moment in the pharaonic history in which someone is missing. They find here and there some lost reference, they find here and there some other data, and time goes by. And there comes a moment at the beginning of the 20th century in which the deposit of the Valley of the Kings is declared exhausted. Everyone says, there is nothing more to excavate here, everything that could be found was found. But there is a guy out there, I am going to tell you. This guy was sure that there was a tomb missing, and so sure was he that he would risk his prestige on it. And his name was Howard Carter. In general, Howard was not very well liked by the archaeologists because he was not an archaeologist. Carter was a draftsman. In reality, he was a draftsman. He was not a scholar who had earned academic degrees or anything like that. In fact, what he knew of Egypt, he knew from having been working in museums at archaeological sites and at the Museum of Egyptology itself in Egypt in Cairo, where he had learned many things and in a self-taught way was capable of translating hieroglyphs. So this self-styled Egyptologist was not much to the liking of the great eminences of that time. But, as often happens, he who does things differently tends to find the answer. Thus, in 1914, when the First World War is about to begin, Howard Carter, British, obtains permission to excavate once again in the Valley of the Kings. The problem is that very soon he would have to set that aside, because the First World War breaks out and he has to enlist and serve as a liaison for the British troops. When the war ends, he begins his excavations again. He is a very persistent man in this and is sure that that missing pharaoh, that missing tomb, must be there. Other experts assured that most probably, that Pharaoh, whom everyone knew as the boy king, would have been buried in some other tomb. He was a tiny piece of history. His passage had not been very significant, and the scant mentions here and there were not such as to consider something important. Thus, the supposition was they buried him in another tomb, and that's it. But Carter was sure not. His investigations, his identifications of certain pieces, of certain tablets, led him to think that this tomb was missing. And thus he went on. He secured funding. An exotic, wealthy British figure, a British lord, Lord Carnarvon, would volunteer for such. In reality, his name was George Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Everyone knew him as Lord Carnarvon or Herbert to his friends. The fact is, this picturesque and peculiar character was a lover of Egypt. For his precarious health, they had always recommended he go to Egypt. Thus, he spent the hot season in England, and during the winter he returned to Cairo, where he felt well, with the dry and warm climate. He was a phlegmatic and strange character, but he trusted Carter and began to finance that. And when the war passes and they return to excavate, well, they return there to the desert, to the Valley of the Kings. It is a terrible condition because it is 50 degrees in full daylight, and although in this site there is almost nothing, in the countryside, yes, there are insects, snakes, scorpions, any number of things. Thus, excavating here is very dangerous. But Carter is set on it. With tie, jacket, elegantly dressed, he arrives at the excavation. Of course, at the end of the day, he ends up in shirt sleeves and with a hat and so on, but he finds nothing. It would seem that destiny did not want them to find the tomb of that mysterious lost pharaoh. The following year neither, and the next. And 1922 arrived and Carter faces a problem. And it is that Lord Carnarvon no longer wants to continue financing that search. Carnarvon has lost faith that they will find something, and certainly it is a great deal that they spend among porters, diggers, Carter's own salary, taxes. It is a great deal of money. And really, what they have been able to find does not go beyond some fragments of vessels, some bones, and some trinket, similar to all those that are stored in great sacks in the Cairo Museum. Carter speaks with him and asks him to help the expedition one last time. One last search, one last expedition, one last aid. And Carnarvon agrees without knowing what destiny had in store for him. It is 1922. Howard Carter, is a man who must already be around 50 years old, if not at least about 49. He is not young, he is a very odd guy. He never married, it was never known that he even had a girlfriend in regular fashion. The English used to have the official wife, the girlfriend, the little friend, the dancer. This guy did not. This was a man who lived with his mind lost out there. He was obsessed with this. From very young he was always obsessed with this. And although he could not study it as such in a school, in a university, his work had led him there. And now he was again in the desert, there in the solitude of those tombs, of those ancient mausoleums. But he does not find much. Things begin to get more and more complicated. The moments become tense. Until that day, November 22nd, 1922. The heat is suffocating, as always. He orders a person who is there, one of the workers, to go for water. That man goes running very happily, and when he comes back carrying an earthen pitcher full of water, he trips, falls, and that thing breaks. Of course, that man laments because he has hit his finger, and he is lying on the floor, and next to him there is this puddle. Carter comes not so much to scold, but to see what happened. There is some commotion, and when he observes, he notices that there is something peculiar on the floor. In his own words. When he described this years later, he was surprised to see that there was a very regular shape. The water had caused part of the sand to settle and to leave uncovered a sort of homogeneous stone. It was strange, because in the place where this guy had fallen, the only thing there were the remains of the ancient tomb of Rameses. Yes, when they vacated that and looted it, the stones, the trash had fallen here in this place. They were rubble, but this piece seemed very stable. It did not seem to be rubble. So he quickly goes for his little trowel, for his little brush, and begins to clean that. And very soon he realizes that it is a step that leads nowhere, because there was nothing there. He cleans the next one, and very soon they realize that they are a sequence of steps that go down into the excavation, in that area of earthworks. The workers begin to act, and in the course perhaps of a day they have removed all the rubble, the trash, the waste that was there, and several steps are uncovered, in total more than 16 steps that descend toward what seems to be the entrance to an unknown tomb. They had found a place. He immediately begins to identify the signs that are there and begins to feel a strange trembling in his hands and a sensation that makes him sweat even more, but at the same time an enormous chill, because he has just discovered inscriptions and a seal that he immediately identifies as the seal of the lost pharaoh. Tutankhamun, he had just found the tomb of the lost pharaoh. He immediately had all that covered back up and protected, because if it became known that that tomb was there, that would be a free-for-all. And he immediately sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon, "Come quickly. I found the tomb. But who the heck was this lost pharaoh?" His own history is quite painful and quite sad. Let me tell you a little. His original name was Nebkheperur. He is lord of the forms of Re. His father was Amenephis IV, Amenhotep IV, as he is also known, or IV. The fact is that his father had been a very problematic pharaoh. He had been a man who had declared monotheism in Egypt. He had forbidden the cult of the principal god, who was Amun, and had replaced it with the cult of his own god, who was Aten. And he was the faceless god and only one cult. And he forbade and expelled people and, well, he made enemies of everyone. But he also changed the capital from Thebes to Amarna, where he established a beautiful artistic city. He was a man who liked painting, music, art. He was not a very good administrator. In fact, he plunged that people into a rather precarious situation. And he was also a very odd subject, because he began being husband to the very beautiful Nefertiti. The great paintings of Nefertiti attest that she was a woman of extraordinary beauty, but he could only beget daughters with her. He could not have sons, and the pharaonic descent was through males, so it is believed that with a concubine he had a son. This male, who was born of the concubine, would face on the one hand the problems of the father, who had obviously left many problems everywhere he went, the enmity, because he was the son of a concubine and not of the queen. But there were more problems, because good old Amenhotep IV seems to have exchanged beautiful Nefertiti for a fellow, a man, a sort of gallant. It seems he had a homosexual preference, because at a certain moment in history, Nefertiti ceases to appear in the paintings and in the carvings and on the stones, and this fellow appears. Some call him the Nubian slave, others simply call him the friend. The fact is that a man appears beside him instead of the beautiful Nefertiti. So all of this generated a flood of problems that, at the end of the day, sent him to death. It is believed that Amenhotep was assassinated, and very probably he was, because his body was handled in improper ways. He was buried improperly. He was handled in an improper way to the point at which, years later, he would be recovered and taken to the Valley of the Kings. But the story he left was a story of many problems. He dies or is assassinated when his son, Nebkheperur, is about 9 years old. Thus, he has to become pharaoh at barely 9 years old, and he acquires a different name. The name his father had given him to reign was Tutankhamun, in relation to the god Aten. Thus, he now assumes that name, Tutankhamun, which is shocking to everyone. And the enmity with the priests becomes terrible. The threats are constant. And there is another problem. The boy is a sickly boy, fragile, with numerous health problems. In the investigations, it could be known that he had problems ranging from cleft palate, which made it difficult for him to speak. He had problems of the skeletal system, one of his feet was turned inward, and he had a problem of a strange calcification that must have caused him much pain and that forced him to use a cane. But besides this, he was a slight-built boy, very slight, very fragile. Over the centuries, the Egyptian pharaonic families had had relations within families, which had led to consanguinity and a tremendous genetic degeneration. So this boy had all the problems one could have. But besides this, he had the enmity of the priests of Amun, whose cult his father had forbidden. Thus, his life was a Calvary from a very early age. Far from being able to play what a child would play, he sat only as a representative figure, because in reality he did not make decisions. The decisions were made by the vizier and at some time also Nefertiti. the widow of the previous pharaoh, who placed him there. But, to ensure the hereditary sequence of her own lineage, she married Tutankhamun to her own daughter, who was his half-sister. Thus, that was a disaster. Nevertheless, despite all this, the decisions that were taken in the time of this young pharaoh were quite successful. He moved the capital back to Thebes, ordered that his father's remains be recovered, treated properly, and buried properly. The remains of Amenhotep IV's father were found in a tomb, also in the Valley of the Kings, in KV 55. After that, he reinstated the polytheistic cult of the god Amun, which earned him to ingratiate himself a bit with the priests. He contracts the marriage, and when he is of sufficient age, his wife becomes pregnant. But tragically, what was born of that relationship did not survive. On 2 occasions, Tutankhamun's wife loses the pregnancy. Are they born? Yes, they are born, but one is born dead, probably a terrible anencephaly, and the other creature lasts a few hours before dying. Congenital problems, obviously. The fact is that without descendants, with a lot of health problems, and with a lot of social and political problems and so on, Tutankhamun dies at barely about 18 or 19 years old. At the time of death, he must have measured 1.60 meters, 1.50 meters. Very slight. The cause of death, well, that is another story because, over the years there has been much inquietude regarding it. There are those who assert that the death of Tutankhamun was caused by a blunt blow to the head. Recent investigations assert that the pharaoh died of malaria. After a painful agony, he would have died, but he also has a complication from a fracture in a leg, probably a fall. But moreover, it was not the first time he had malaria, because the genetic information that was found corresponded to several episodes. It was possible to identify genetically the presence of DNA of the bug that produces malaria, but not only on one occasion. And to top it off, there are those who maintain that the death could have been by both causes. That is, that being gravely ill, he was killed to put an end to that. And thus his days ended when he had barely spent about 10 years on the pharaonic throne. He left no offspring, it was the end of the 18th dynasty, and his remains were sent to the Valley of the Kings. Now then, let us return to the tomb. Once Howard Carter finds the tomb of the lost pharaoh, he realizes there is a discrepancy, and it is that the original name was Tutankhamun, but at the moment of being buried, he was buried as Tutankhamun. Hence, that still after death, there would have been a later affront. The pharaoh's name was changed after death. The only time Tutankhamun is mentioned is in all the documents and in all the inscriptions and graphics and so on after death. In life, he continued to be Tutankhamun, but after death, the walls of his tomb, the seals, the inscriptions, had changed his name. Thus, even after death, he continued to have no value for those people. The fact is that the tomb was practically intact. When Lord Carnarvon arrives and they all gather there on that November 26th, about 50 people are there for the opening of the first door. Indeed, there is a little hole above. It is observed that at some moment they tried to enter. This tomb had probably already been looted, but in a very ancient way, because it was repaired. Even so, they managed to open that, and bringing a candle close, Carter leans in to see what there is. And that is when Carnarvon from outside shouts to him, "Howard, what is it you see?" And Carter answers, "I see wonders like never have been seen." Afterwards they would open that. The tomb as such had an antechamber where there were multiple objects strewn about, evidence that the looters had indeed entered there at some moment. But the things had been put back in place, and there were incredible things. There was a sort of toy. Probably the pharaoh's toy when he was a child, he had kept it. There were remains of chariots, there were remains of chairs, of seats. Afterwards, there was a part known as the annex, where there were other various objects. Then there were 2 statues, 2 guardians standing next to a wall. In principle, it would seem that that led nowhere, but shortly after it was seen that that was the entrance to the burial chamber. And inside it, various enclosures, these of perfectly carved wood, covered with gold, were intact. and inside them, the principal sarcophagus, which in turn was subdivided several times until reaching the place where the mummy was kept. And there, beyond, was the treasure chamber, a small room where there were incredible things, among others more than 100 canes, of gold, ivory, fine woods, incredible things, which showed that the pharaoh not only liked to keep them, but used them because many of them had wear. There were also bows. And beyond, there were also some jars with the pharaoh's internal organs, and there were the 2 jars containing the remains of those babies who were born of the relationship with his wife. And the pharaoh was there. Everything was almost intact. It was evident that they had tried to take it out, probably at some moment very close to the burial, because the tomb had been restored and the things had been put back in order. And afterwards no one found it for a simple reason, because the pharaoh was so insignificant that he was not remembered. And they threw trash onto the tomb. They covered it with stones, they covered it with rubble. The looters themselves established a sort of settlement over the tomb. There were remains that gave indications that huts and constructions had been built on top that later had been swept away with the passage of time, but remains were left. It is very likely that those very looters lived on top of the pharaoh's tomb. But there were more problems. There were about 5,000 objects in there, many of them of gold, very valuable. The sarcophagus had never been opened at any time, so it was intact. But there were several things. The first was that the tomb was a really very small tomb. Yes, contrary to what you imagine, the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun was a very small tomb. It did not have great corridors, it did not have great vaults. It had nothing more than these 2 medium-sized rooms and these 2 small ones, and a staircase that had been filled in with rubble. But moreover, some of the indications that could be taken from the walls gave reason to think that this tomb was not even for him. It is very likely that they recycled the tomb for him. This was a tomb for some official, for some lesser noble. It was not a pharaoh's tomb, regardless of the fact that he was such a young pharaoh. This was not a pharaoh's tomb. It hardly had enough space for the sarcophagus itself, and its enclosure hardly had cramped space for the treasures that were stored there, which revealed that he had died suddenly. They did not have time to build it. It was not expected that he would die, which supported the hypothesis of violent death. But at the same time, new studies yielded the possibility that he might have died of malaria. Thus, both can be quite compatible. The pharaoh died quickly and they had to bury him because the time to do so was expiring. And obviously, they chose what there was. Thus, even after death, not only did they change his name, but they buried him in a tomb that was not even worthy of a pharaoh. But beyond that, when all this begins to be worked, the objects that are taken to the Cairo Museum begin to be classified. Carefully, each thing is packed, marked, photographed, where it was, drawn. It is an incredibly arduous work. Numerous researchers, archaeologists, and all kinds of people participate in the cataloging, cleaning, ordering, and shipping. Carter heads all of this in a task that would take the next 10 years of his life. It would be his great passion. Constantly in the media he gave statements, spoke of this, presented evidence, reports. He became a celebrity. But moreover, the moment came to open the sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus was composed of several layers, the exterior of stone. Then there came an inner sarcophagus that in turn had great details and workmanship covered with gold, of incredible beauty. Then there was another sarcophagus, and then the mummy. The problem is that between one and the other there was a sort of glue. The embalming liquids that had been poured over the principal sarcophagus had hardened over the course of hundreds of years and had become a sort of incredibly hard resin that prevented that from being retrieved. Little by little, and with great care, with a small chisel they were freeing more and more. With a hot knife they removed sheets of that until at last it could be opened. And the very beautiful figure of the pharaoh found with his pectoral, with his jewelry ornaments, drowned in that very liquid. The body was submerged in that substance, which is why to extract it they broke it. Yes, just as I am telling you. The pharaoh's body, to be taken out of the last sarcophagus, was sectioned. They cut it crudely and grotesquely. Do not imagine a careful job. When Carter found out about that, because that last stage was not done by him, he about had a fit. The one who ordered this and who would later carry out the X-rays made the happy decision to cut it crudely into several pieces. Moreover, in the X-ray the cuts are observed, a last affront to this pharaoh. It does not matter much to me if you think it is nonsense to think that a corpse would have dignity. The fact is that they treated him as if he were machaca. Yes, dried meat for making stews. It was little short of doing that, being the most crude, in the fashion of the ancient looters. Do not lose sight of these details. The fact is that once that atrocity was done, the mummy is sent to Cairo, where the studies continue. It is photographed. Many X-rays are made, and it is there when the hypothesis arises that he died from a blow to the nape, something that very probably can be discarded taking into account the brutality with which the body was removed. So, well, after that the cataloging continues, and when they finish doing it, in 1932-1934, Carter is left without a job. The tomb of Tutankhamun would become the most important tomb found in Egypt. Not because of the pharaoh's own importance. The pharaoh was a pharaoh whose history was minimal, but because of the almost intact find. There were only two tombs, the 46, KV 46, which was a tomb of nobles. It was not such an important tomb, and KV 62 belonging to Tutankhamun. The find as such was important because of that, because it was almost complete, and especially the funerary enclosure, the burial chamber, as it is also known, was intact. Thus, from there, the information obtained, the data, all that, gave it a great importance, but at the same time also gave it great media relevance, and it became very popular in the 1920s. The newspapers talked about this. There were publications, but mainly they talked about something. The curse. That is a part that has drawn everyone's attention. The fact of the curse of the pharaoh's tomb. Let us begin, because when Howard Carter discovers the entrance still has the original seal with the ropes and the pharaoh's seal. Thus, this tomb was intact, and although there is not clear evidence of where the idea that there was a curse came from, Carter himself assured that he did not see it. But others who were there did assure that there were certain tablets, a sort of clay works that warned about this curse to whoever would perpetrate that. As an interesting fact, in many other tombs there were very varied curses. It is not a matter that would be a myth. The reality is that in many tombs there were tablets and inscriptions that warned the perpetrators, the thieves, of what would happen to them if they came there. From dying eaten by a crocodile, to being devoured by a hippopotamus, to being bitten by a snake. There were many possible curses, but there were also some that were really obscene because they were grotesque things, such as that a donkey would kill you in relation to the donkey doing some misdeed to you and similar things. So that did exist. Curses did exist. And it is very likely that there had been several of these on the door of the tomb. But there is where the strange begins. The curse of the mummy. The curse of the pharaoh Tutankhamun would begin shortly before the tomb itself was opened. Carter would relate years later how all that began. He was in Cairo doing some business, and when he returns to his house, near the excavations, he runs into very bad news. Days earlier, the solitary Howard Carter had brought with him a canary, a beautiful canary. The little animal was in its cage and was cared for with affection. Carter was a man who lived alone and who was always alone. Thus, he used to have a small pet. Some time earlier, he had had a donkey that had died, but now he had a canary, a beautiful canary that used to sing happily. So when Carter was sitting at his table with his pipe and his things, the canary would cheer him a little. He was pleased to see it. When he returns from Cairo, after having sent the cable notifying of the find, before opening the tomb, he learns that the canary was devoured by a cobra. Yes, a cobra. A snake had entered Carter's room, had managed to get into the canary's cage and had devoured it. One of the employees had found the cobra inside the cage. It had been able to enter, devoured the canary, but it had not been able to leave, and they killed it. The cobra was the guardian of the pharaohs. On those 2 sculptures that were found at the door of the entrance to the funerary enclosure, to the burial chamber, the 2 protective images, the 2 guardians had cobras on their foreheads. But it does not end there. When Lord Carnarvon finally arrives and they are ready to begin the opening of the tomb, above them a falcon begins to circle. Horus, the protector, the avenger, the one who would exact vengeance on those who would perpetrate the tombs, on those who would break into the tombs. And then the authorization arrives and the representatives of the museum arrive, who will witness the opening of the tomb. But it is decided to stop that, because an unusual sandstorm begins that does not allow them to see beyond their own noses, and they have to leave. As everyone withdraws, shortly before nightfall, the storm abates, and Carter withdraws, accompanied by Carnarvon and Evelyn. Secretly, they would make the first incursion. They did not violate the door, but they opened it. Carnarvon was determined that his first chisel be used to open the first hole, the one his mother had given him when he was young. It was a keepsake, and he was a romantic. Thus he brought that piece, and with a little hammer he opened that hole. The next day, of course, with great fanfare, the seals were removed and all that was opened. But the first incursion was them. That night about 50-odd people were there. They were outside, but only a few people entered the enclosure, who bore witness to the find. Shortly after, the problems would begin. The people who were there, the first to arrive, the ancient Egyptians, those who lived in the region, warned that those were not good signs. They warned that that which was written there was real, and there was fear of these things. It was true that there was fear, and it was not something that had been left back there behind the veil of time. This tomb is from 1300 before Christ, which means that when Carter arrives there, that tomb was 3,000 and some years old, and yet it was intact. They begin to do the works, all that begins, and it is when the first death occurs. And the death would be precisely that of Lord Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon had been in that first incursion, and had been there in the following days, despite his health not being very good and all that. He was a man who had been for years in Egypt. But then he was bitten by a mosquito on the face, on the cheek, and he did not take much care. He went on, and then he developed a fever, and after the fever, a strange malady, deliriums, shivers. Apparently, the infection progressed until it encompassed everything, a sort of septicemia with a pneumonia, and on April 5th, 1923, he is dead, in the Savoy Hotel in Cairo, where he resided. He is dead. There is a very strange moment. It is said that all of a sudden Cairo is left without light, a total blackout. There is a series of strange lightning bolts that no one expected because there is no storm, and the lights go out, and then the hotel employees run up to check on Lord Carnarvon, knowing that he was ill and that with the power failure he would need some lamp or something. But when they arrive, he is dead. His eyes are open and a strange expression. That is what the rumor-mongers assure. It is difficult to know if it was so, but the fact is that he died. And the cause, according to many of the testimonies of the time, was nothing other than the mosquito bite that became infected with the shaving and progressed to a major infection that ended his life. He was an older man. He would have been about 70 years old, it is true, but he had been in Egypt many times. He had traveled. He was not a man one could think would die like that. And of course, he would be the first victim of the curse, according to the belief. And curiously, the mosquito that bit him on March 26th. There are those who assure that this occurred in Cairo. The reality is that on March 26th, Lord Carnarvon was at the excavation when the mosquito bit him. There are no mosquitoes in the desert. They were several kilometers from the nearest vegetation, in the middle of significant heat and an absolute environmental dryness that would not allow there to be mosquitoes. Therefore, the fact that, being inside an ancient tomb, a mosquito bites you, does it not seem suspicious? But he would not be the only one. In September of 1923, Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's brother, dies, and he dies also in a similar way, of a septicemia. He had lost all his teeth in a sort of odd treatment, and this led him to an awful decline in his health. It is worth pointing out that although Aubrey had not been in the tomb, he was very close to Lord Carnarvon and had maintained correspondence. And not only that, he had received some gifts, small objects that had been sent so that he would know the marvelous finds. Certainly, Lord Carnarvon had not stolen them. He had asked permission for them to be sent and be seen there, to later return them. Aubrey had had them in his house. It should be noted that his death was particularly painful. Subsequently, it would be Richard Bethel. Bethel was basically also part of the excavation. He was Carter's assistant during the excavations, and he was a strong subject. He was 46 years old at the time of his death, and he was murdered on November 15, 1929, by a blunt blow to the nape. There was no reason, there was no robbery, nothing. Arthur Mace would also have died. Arthur Mace died in 1928, in April, of a strange mix, pleurisy with pneumonia. He had worked in the tomb with Carter for a long time. His death was not expected. It was of a strange origin. He was part of the New York Museum and had been collaborating there when he was found dead. He had a strange expression on his face, and there are those who assure that in the previous days, delirious, he was afraid of what he was seeing in front of him. Another of the victims who is said to have been a victim of the curse was George J. Gould. He died very close in 1923, on May 16th. Gould was a North American oil entrepreneur and adventurer who had been invited by Lord Carnarvon himself. He had been in the tomb, he had been there talking, having fun, and they had even made a sort of picnic. George was a very strong man, very healthy, who traveled constantly and who moreover was known to be a sort of monument to health. And nevertheless he died that May 16th of an unusual fever, the very afternoon he came out of the tomb again. There are rumors that assure that his last moments of life were delirious and of much fear. Another of the victims would be Lord Westbury. Lord Westbury was the father of Carter's assistant, Richard Bethel, and he committed suicide while at his residence in England. He had been worried to an extreme degree, voicing his concern not only for his own health, he was a man of 70-odd years, but for the fact that he was next on the list of the curse because he had in his house some objects that had also been brought there for their classification, and they had stored them in his house. He was terrified of that and assured he had seen the silhouette of a young dark-skinned man prowling through his room. In one of his diaries he inscribed a strange text that it is impossible to endure these horrors any longer, and he threw himself out the window from a high floor of his house, meeting death. It was related to the curse because of the fact of having pieces that were inside the burial chamber. From there, the following deaths are also strange. The radiologist who attended this case and who made the x-rays of the mummy, Dr. Douglas Reed, Dr. Douglas Reed in your text. A specialist radiologist with a tremendous career dies in 1924 in February, being in Switzerland. Reed had been one of those who had the happy idea to cut the mummy in order to x-ray it. He himself was there. It is said that he died from a poisoning. Extra-officially, and according to some legends that cannot be corroborated, but that are out there, it is assured that his last moments of life were also of great fear, assuring he was seeing, like Lord Westbury, the silhouette of a young dark-skinned man prowling. No one else saw him, of course. From there, we go to Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey. This subject had also been in the tomb in 23, shortly after it was opened to the visits of some eminent personages. This guy, Ali Kamel Fahmy, would arrive to visit along with his wife, a very renowned European actress. During their stay, all that was so strange. Her behavior, that of the wife, of course, was odd. She acted in a strange way. Ali Kamel himself would notice this and would comment, arguing something like that the heat was harming her. A few days later, his wife would murder him. Yes, days after having been in the tomb and having remained there for quite a while, accompanying Carter, talking, touching objects. She, in particular, killed her husband. It is considered part of the curse. After that, there was also Sir Bruce Ingram. He did not die, but his house, where he kept several pieces and had numerous documents related to the tomb, caught fire. He suffered burns, and several people from his own family died. Coincidentally, all those places in which there were remains and pieces brought from Egypt, which belonged to KV 62, to this tomb of the boy pharaoh, suffered some sort of mishap. And although in this case Sir Bruce Ingram did not die, he had a very bad time. Then would come George Benedict, your text George Benedict. He was an Egyptologist who died on March 26, 1926, shortly after having been in the tomb. He had been collaborating with Carter in the last works for the recovery both of the mummy and of some objects that were in there. His death has never been clear. He was a relatively young man, and upon just returning, he met death. After the tomb is totally catalogued and all the objects are removed and placed in the Cairo Museum, and some are in England, there is a sort of movement to recover the ancient customs. And in 1939, a local radio station is going to do a sort of festival in relation to ancient cultures and all that, and obtains a very rare permission. It is the permission for some instruments that were used in the time of the ancient Egyptians to be used there, and these include some of the instruments that were recovered from Tutankhamun's tomb. All the paperwork is done, all the requirements, and a vehicle is sent to pick up those boxes that contain the instruments. They will be guarded. There will be surveillance of everything. Well, much care, except with the curse itself, because the instruments never arrive. The vehicle that was going to pick them up loses control on the way, goes off the road, and the driver dies. The festival is canceled, of course. After that, well, there are some testimonies that assure that in 1966 a director of the Cairo Museum died run over after signing the documents that authorized the sending of a massive exhibition, which included the mummy itself, to London for 1972. It is also told that the new director of the museum suffers a similar fate after attempting a second exhibition. After that, well, there have been some rumors out there. In fact, some of them are quite recent, which leads one to think that the curse would still be active. At least, that is what the legend says. What is a fact is that the pharaoh himself was sent back to his tomb. Yes, the mummy of the pharaoh Tutankhamun is currently in a hermetic glass chamber, with controlled temperature, with controlled humidity, in his own tomb, there in the Valley of the Kings, in KV 62. The tomb as such has been prepared so that people can visit it. It is not a spacious space. The space there is minimal, barely enough to approach. There are those who assure that all this so complicated that it has been to send the mummy adapt the tomb for visits and all, is nothing other than to move the mummy away from the museum where it was causing many problems. They may be myths or legends. Howard Carter himself assured that all this was false, that there was no such thing as a curse, and Carter assured that the ancient Egyptians did not put curses, contrary to what would be demonstrated later with certain finds where there are indeed curses. Carter said that he would have been the first to suffer the curse, and nevertheless he died of natural causes in his 60s of a lymphatic cancer, being in London in 1934. So, for many, the fact that Carter did not die victim of the curse upon barely crossing the door is the best example that the curse is not real. What few know is that Carter had a secret out there. Well, he had many secrets. He was a very quiet man, very silent. But what few know is that Carter generally carried with him an amulet. Yes, of course you will tell me, oh sir, where did you get that from? Well, it is something that is rumored and was said, and that Carter himself once showed, a scarab, an ancient scarab amulet, the protector. Thus, Carter was not subject to the curse, he was protected by the ancient scarab. So, well, of course, some recent researchers maintain that none of this is true, and that in reality the deaths that were occurring were perfectly expectable, because they were people of advanced ages, because they were in a dangerous place. For whatever you wish and command, the reality is that of all those people who were in the tomb, only 8 died in a period of 10 years. However, what is interesting is how they died, and many of them and their relatives suffered horrible things in a short period of time, which leads one to think for some researchers of the paranormal phenomenon that the curse of Tutankhamun may have cost the lives of about 30 people in a short period of time, plus a bunch of problems, such as, for example, the captain of the plane that was carrying some things for an exhibition and who had to return to Cairo because the wind would not let him leave. The storms, the lightning, prevented the plane from continuing the trip, and he had to return to the airport on 2 occasions, until finally, and after asking permission, they were able to take off and travel. And it is told that this has happened on several occasions when collections have been sent for exhibitions in other countries. It may be a myth, I do not doubt it, but it would not be the only one. There are 2 or 3 matters out there that are interesting. The first of them is the story of Ramesses II. I do not know if you have ever heard it, but when the mummy of Ramesses II was recovered, it was taken to the museum, placed in a special area in a glass display case far from where people would see it. Only some experts and some dignitaries could approach to see it. It was 1902, and at that moment something unthinkable happened. Suddenly, the mummy lifted its arm and broke the glass. Yes, just as I am telling you. There are those who assure that it did not get to break it, but that it simply struck it and caused the guards and the visitors who were at that moment to run away. And it was the beginning of a lot of problems that led to the mummy being treated in a different way. Measures were taken, of course, and it was placed in an adequate and honorable way according to its status. Subsequently, we have the case of the unlucky mummy. We have a video about that. In reality, it is not a mummy, but a funerary cover of a priestess, a beautiful wooden carving that has caused many problems wherever it goes, because it was removed from its temple in an improper way, and nothing to say of some other cases, such as that of the curse of Pateti. In the case of the curse of Pateti, it is a funerary stele that includes a powerful curse that says something like, "Whoever does something bad against us or destroys this tomb will be eaten by crocodiles, hippopotamuses, lions, snakes, and scorpions." So it is clear that there were indeed other curses. And if from there we go skipping to other cursed objects and other similar things, well, why not think that this poor pharaoh, who had everything go badly in life, who had an interrupted childhood, a childhood, moreover, with many health problems, with problems from consanguinity, from an undesirable inheritance, that his father left him a disastrous state, enmities, and that finally even his own children die at birth, that his life is totally ruined and that his death was not treated properly. His body was buried in a tomb that was not for pharaohs, with a name that was not his. Simply for political reasons, his name was changed. Tutankhaten is the servant of Aten, but since his father was a worshipper of Aten and had caused many problems, when they buried him, they changed his name to Tutankhamun, the servant of Amun, and consequently, even his name was changed. And even worse, when the researchers arrive and discover that, well, they destroy the mummy doing horrible, vulgar things. And even though technically the find and the classification of all that was appropriate and in a careful manner, the treatment of the mummy was not at all.